fisheries itself, from the 1960s onwards, the Indian government began to push a strategy of mechanization and development, right? But this was not new. We, again, like if you look at the colonial state also did so. And they did it with a very clear agenda. India had gone through famines, right? They needed to think about securing a food source that was not linked to the agrarian economy. And in that sense, the colonial state envisioned that if they develop the fisheries very well, here would be a resource that could be employed and deployed very effectively to quell famines whenever they happen, right? At the same time, they begin to realize that this might also be an alternative source of revenue for the colonial state, right? So there's very interesting work that documents this, Ajanta Subramaniam's work, for instance, in the Madras presidency, which looks at the various kind of experiments undertaken by the Madras presidency to mechanize and develop the fisheries over there. And in Bombay, one realizes that there was a sort of intense communication going on between the Madras presidency and the Bombay presidency, where the Bombay presidency was like, you do your experiments, and if they are successful, we will also deploy them. Right? And somewhere around in 1914 actually, the colonial state, the government of the Bombay presidency begins to start pushing for mechanization, introducing insulation facilities so that you can store your fish longer, you can transport it to distant markets which may not be on the coast, right? All this kind of effort, energy, resources are put in. And it works for a little while, and then it sort of, it slumps and it falls through, and they realize that it's not generating the amount of revenue that they thought they would. Being the colonial state, they of course blamed this on the fisher people themselves, and they said they don't have a mindset to adopt capitalism that in the way we want them to. They haven't really understood it. This is too traditional a community, it's too backward a community, and therefore the experiment ends right there, right? But if you cut to the 1960s, then suddenly something very interesting is happening all over the coasts in India. What is happening is that somewhere off the Kerala coast, they discover, they have trawlers operating. Trawlers are these mechanized boats that are developed. I mean, initially the technology comes from the World War period, right? They would literally trawl the bottom of the seabed looking for sea mines, okay? So that was the idea with which trawlers were adopted, and then they're soon brought into fishing because they realize there's immense potential here. We put a huge net, and you can actually, if you're literally scooping up the bed of the seafloor, look at the amount of fish that you can actually catch in this, right? So it sort of exponentially rises, the amount of fish that you can catch compared to what was happening in small scale fishing. And they realize here is a great opportunity to develop this further, to expand the scales of operation. Most importantly, once again, the Indian state goes back to the same question that the colonial state does, and it says, here is a way in which we can secure a great source of protein for the people of our country, as well as the fact that we can generate a huge amount of revenue, right? And incidentally, the fisheries today do contribute fairly significantly to the Indian GDP. It's somewhere around the tune of 1.7% of the GDP comes from this huge amounts of exports that are actually happening from the fisheries itself, right? So this happens when trawling begins around the coast of Kerala, and they discover that they are able to catch large amounts of prawns, right? And there is a discovery of a very large export market for prawns. UK, US, Russia, they were all importing prawns at this point of time. And the Indian government decides to jump on this bandwagon and say, let's push this, right? If we develop the export of prawns, here is a great revenue stream for the Indian state. And slowly in various coastal states, they start beginning to push this project, right? So from the 1960s onwards, we see concerted effort towards introducing not just mechanization on small boats, right? So it's not just putting a small motor on a boat and sending them out with the same level of technology otherwise in the form of nets or whatever, but they start actively pushing the idea of trawlers in the fisheries, right? And they start providing subsidies for this. They start encouraging people from within the community to take on these subsidies in a cooperative fashion. So they say if 7 people can get together and put some form of down payment down, the government would then fund you for the rest of your trawler, right? And they saw this as being extremely profitable ventures. They said a community that is economically and socially backward can rise through this. So it was perceived as a win-win for everyone, right? In 1982, you also had the introduction of the law of sea, which argued for a liberalization of access to territorial waters in case the Indian state itself was not able to, extract whatever value they wanted out of it. And they also slowly began to allow for deep sea fishing, in which they invited foreign capital to be invested, right? This policy was eventually dropped in the late 90s owing to a response from fishing movements, fisher people movements themselves. And it is in this broad context that the National Fish Workers Forum emerges, right? They begin from smaller formations in the coastal states, particularly in Kerala, Tamil Nadu, etc. They gradually coalesce to form the National Fish Workers Forum, as they call it, a people's movement along the coast with a clear agenda, they say, of safeguarding small-scale fishing, because they think this is what needs to be protected. Where I'm pitching my work is trying to look at what were the problems that the fisher people were facing, and specifically what was the solution sought here, right? And it is in between these two that we see a whole range of sort of dynamics appear. So in 2013, the NFF, that's the National Fish Workers Forum, brings together representatives from every state, every coastal state, and they organize a meeting, a protest, a week-long protest at Jantar Mantar in Delhi, and send a petition to the union government saying, with a long list of demands, these are demands that they have been making from the 90s onwards, right? Some of them include, for instance, a separate ministry for the fisheries, bringing in, because we need someone who actually understands the concerns of what is happening on the coast, right? You can't have an agrarian policy that is so clear and then a sort of, disconnected version of that is brought into the fisheries. So that was again one of their key demands. But what was very interesting was that in 2013, they were also making a demand to say that only traditional fishing communities should be given the rights over fishing, right? And they did so because the NFF was making the argument that traditional communities, traditional fishing communities are able to exploit resources and exploit the commons of the seas in a sustainable ecological manner, right? That their customary practices are geared towards ecological sustainability in some ways. There was a conjuring, so to speak, of a moral economy that is operating here. The idea was that it's not just sustainable use, but through sustainable use, everybody was able to actually survive over here. So you didn't have one trawler, for instance, taking up the catch of the fish, leaving other people with nothing, but rather that, everybody was able to survive, and not just survive, they were able to do well because of this, right? So they were making the argument that you need to go back and fashion a policy where you're not only saying no foreign capital should enter, because if you remember, as I mentioned, in 1982, they were opening up to foreign capital, and that was dropped in 97, but now they were saying even domestic capital that enters fishing from outside the community is a problem, right? So they were trying to look for a situation where they said that the problems that in the fisheries, which were primarily they identified as a question of pollution of the waters, which was affecting the amount of fish catch. They were talking about situations where you have deep sea fishing going on, lots of trawling happening, which has led to a situation where they said that the catch of the fish is actually coming down. In fact, in the state of Kerala, there was actually a year where they recorded a fish famine. There was no fish to be caught, right? Because something that trawlers end up doing is to also catch the what we call juvenile fish, or the young of the species, right? And when you keep catching smaller and smaller fish, you're not going to see a rejuvenation of the species actually take place. What was being done at small scale fishing was that they had specially designed nets to actually catch only adult sized fishes, right? And therefore you constantly saw a rejuvenation of the species. And this was precisely the peg that the NFF was using to say, look, there is a history of sustainable practices within the community. There is a history of large capital entering and introducing capital intensive technology, because trawlers are extremely expensive pieces of equipment to run, right? If you take a trawler out to sea, for a period of say 8 days, you're going to run a cost of at least 8 to 10 lakhs, right? But also think about it this way: if you're putting in 8 to 10 lakhs for a 10-day period, the amount of catch that they get and what the price that they're able to sell it for in both the export market as well as the domestic market has now reached such high levels that they're able to actually make this a profitable venture, right? So the NFF had this clear position that only the traditional community ought to have a role therefore, right? Because this is the only way for us to safeguard the resource. The resource is going to deplete and die away, and we're going to have severe problems if this is to continue. Now, when I was looking at the question of what was happening in Bombay, right, the way in which this demand was received was actually very interesting, because how the NFF operates is that it's a larger fishery movement. They've also registered themselves as a union. They operate in every state with local organizations in the form of either cooperatives or trade unions. And in Maharashtra, they were working with an organization called the Maharashtra Machimar Kruti Samiti, which is registered as a charity organization. It's not registered as a trade union. So the Maharashtra Machimar Kruti Samiti was of the point of view that the NFF had taken a correct stand, and they were behind them in the idea that the coolies alone should have a right to fishing in the state of Bombay, right? Particularly significant because, again, as I mentioned, Bombay's history means global capital has played a role here before. So when you do open up this, this resource, there are enough potential investors looking to come into the fisheries. There's also strong domestic capital operating. So the argument was that fishing is no longer now the livelihood of a community, but instead we have a situation where people from outside the community have come in and started taking over this work, right? At the local level, the problem was perceived in another way, which is that when you have this kind of technology entering, it also makes it unsustainable to practice small scale fishing anymore, right? The scales of operation just keep expanding to a point where small scale fishers are pushed out of the market, right? And so you are either forced to go take the route of buying a trawler or find other sources of livelihood. And you know, the more and more people one spoke to, Koli men in particular I spoke to, found that eventually if you weren't a trawler owner, you couldn't sustain yourself in the fisheries, and so they would put their customary knowledge to other kinds of uses. So in Bombay, there are a lot of water sports companies that have emerged, right? And all the boys you see who drive those water ski jets and who are the lifeguards posted, etc., they are invariably Koli men, right? Because these are now the occupations that they take to. Or they work as labor in fishing and they run their boat, but they might also be working as watchmen in the posh buildings that have now surrounded their neighborhoods. They might be working as watchmen over there to just sustain themselves, right? So the pressures of living in an urban city where the cost of living is so high, the standard of living is increasingly pushes you in a certain kind of direction, means that their own livelihood, their own historically practiced occupation is no longer available to them as a way to sustain themselves in the city, right? The Koli women also faced a problem because of this, because they were making the argument that when you have trawlers operate, you have a whole new set of people who enter the market. This is a market that was otherwise organized between Koli fishermen and Koli fisherwomen, but now you have middlemen who are associated with export companies coming with credit that they can extend to these fishermen to buy large amounts of fish, and that sort of pushes these women more and more to the sideline. So they're unable to actually even buy a decent amount of fish from the market. Then they face other pressures when they go to sell in the market, and increasingly they face a new threat in the form of what they call, and this is where the real clash emerges, they use the term bhaiya, right? So again, if you are familiar with Bombay, this might be, you might know what this term sort of refers to. It's used as a slang term for migrants from the north, right? And for Koli women, the biggest problem at that point of time was that they were contending in a very, very limited market with now migrant men who were coming in and buying small amount of fish in the market and going around and operating as retailers and sellers of fish. But they were not doing this in the traditional way. The traditional way was to buy the fish and sell it at a market, right? Migrant men would buy small amounts of fish and move from one building to another, right? So imagine the convenience, you're living in an apartment building and instead of having to venture out to your fish market, somebody has come to your doorstep and is selling you fish. And so increasingly the footfall at markets began to fall. This was one of the reasons, but not the only reason why Koli fisherwomen face problem. The other was also that there were a lot associated with the technology that came in and the higher catch, the high price in the fish. These women were unable to even buy certain amounts of fish, the minimal amounts of fish that they were looking for. There were all kinds of ecological problems associated. Coasts of Bombay see a lot of commercial activity in shipping. If there was an oil spill, for instance, which happened in the early 2000s, they had a situation where the fish that was coming in couldn't be sold, right? So, and since they're dependent on it on a daily basis to run their houses, they were sort of rendered absolutely impoverished as a result of that, right? So, there is a whole range of problems that were operating. And in this range of problems that were operating, increasingly, because the question of ecology was positioned as most forward, as sustainable ecological practices were pushed more forward, what increasingly begins to happen is that a situation arises where the notion of the community as being the only way through which sustainability can be maintained starts emerging, right? And the